11 missiles, 4 pilots, 47 minutes, 9 kills. That's the math of a single night over the Black Sea coast. May 14, 2026, when Ukraine's Air Force ran the most precise cruise missile intercept operation of the entire war. A night that Russian long-range aviation planners never expected to end the way it did. A night 4 Ukrainian F-16 pilots will carry with them for the rest of their lives, though none of them will ever tell you their names. The target was Odesa, specifically the port district, the grain terminals, the logistics corridors, the infrastructure that has kept Ukrainian agricultural exports alive through 4 years of war. Russia had struck this district before. They knew the layout, they knew the value, and on the night of May 14th, Russian planners believed they had assembled a strike package large enough to overwhelm whatever stood between their bombers and that grain terminal. They were wrong, by 6 seconds. This is the story of what happens when intelligence, preparation, and 4 pilots converge in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Stay with me, because what unfolds over the next 47 minutes above the Ukrainian coast is not just a tactical success. It's a masterclass in how a smaller air force, outnumbered and outgunned for 4 years, learned to fight smarter than its enemy could plan. I'm your host at War Vector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. The night begins not over Odesa, but over the Caspian Sea, more than 1,800 kilometers to the east, where Russian long-range aviation has been repositioning its Tu-95 Bear bombers for weeks. These are not subtle aircraft. The Tu-95 is a Cold War giant, 4 turboprop engines, a wingspan of nearly 50 meters, and an acoustic signature that Ukrainian intelligence assets have been tracking since late April. Each aircraft can carry between 8 and 16 Kh-101 cruise missiles, the long-range standoff weapon Russian planners have been deploying in mass strikes throughout 2025 and into 2026. The Kh-101 is a sophisticated weapon, terrain-following guidance, low radar cross-section, a range exceeding 5,500 kilometers, and a conventional warhead of roughly 400 kilograms. It was designed to be hard to intercept. It was designed to arrive in groups too large for any single air defense layer to handle. Russian doctrine on these strikes is well documented. The theory of saturation, launch enough missiles, and even a well-organized air defense network will let some through. The math of exhaustion. Which weapon system is deadlier in these mass strike scenarios? HIMARS suppressing launch support infrastructure, traditional air defense artillery, or interceptor aircraft like the F-16? Comment below. We're going to come back to this question with some numbers that might surprise you. But the Tu-95s positioned over the Caspian on May 14th were flying into a different tactical situation than Russian planners understood. 3 weeks earlier, on April 23rd, Ukrainian Air Force intelligence analysts had completed a pattern analysis assessment of Russian cruise missile launch profiles going back through late 2025 and the first months of 2026. The assessment identified something specific, a recurring corridor. When Russian bombers launched from the Caspian basin targeting Odesa, the missiles consistently tracked a southwest arc through neutral airspace before descending toward the Ukrainian coast near Mykolaiv and banking northwest toward the port. The corridor wasn't perfectly fixed. Russian planners varied it slightly on each strike, but the variance fell within a predictable envelope, and Ukrainian Air Force planners had been quietly building a response. The classified intercept corridor was established on April 26th. Ukrainian F-16 patrols operating out of a western airbase, location undisclosed in official records, began flying the corridor in rotating 4-ship formations during the hours when Russian bomber activity over the Caspian historically peaked. The patrols were quiet. They produced no engagements during the 3 weeks of preparation. They were designed not to. The idea was to make the corridor invisible, to establish a patrol rhythm that produced no signature, no intercept, no data for Russian ISR assets to flag as a change in Ukrainian defensive posture. The trap needed to look like empty sky. I spent time going through the declassified radar track data that Ukrainian Air Force released in the weeks after May 14th, and one detail kept coming back to me. The intercept corridor was designed not just for where the missiles would be, but for when they would be most vulnerable. The KH-101, for all its sophistication, goes through a brief navigational adjustment phase, approximately 40 kilometers before it begins its terminal descent profile. During that window, roughly 90 seconds, it's slightly more predictable. Ukrainian analysts had identified this window in earlier intercept attempts. They built their engagement geometry around it. The 4-ship patrol airborne on May 14th had been in the corridor for 2 hours and 11 minutes when the first radar cue arrived. Time: 11:47 p.m. Altitude: 7,200 meters. The lead aircraft, callsign Franco 1, received the track data first. 11 inbound contacts. Heading 247 degrees. Time to Ukrainian territorial airspace: approximately 22 minutes. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes determines whether Odesa's grain terminal survives the night. And the margin is going to be razor thin. The 4 pilots split their assignments in the air. This is worth understanding in detail, because the targeting discipline in those 11 minutes of radio exchange is one of the most tactically sophisticated elements of the entire engagement. Franco 1 and Franco 2, the lead element, would engage the first wave. Ukrainian radar had identified 2 distinct subgroups in the incoming strike package. 7 missiles were tracking slightly ahead in the corridor, spaced roughly 12 to 15 kilometers apart. The trailing 4 were running 4 minutes behind. Franco 3 and Franco 4, the trail pair, would hold, let the lead element engage the first wave, then reposition for intercept geometry on the second wave as it descended toward the coast. Each F-16 carried AIM-120C AMRAAM missiles, the medium-range active radar homing weapon, supplied through NATO channels and cleared for Ukrainian service in late 2025. The AIM-120C has an effective range against low RCS targets, like the KH-101, that Ukrainian Air Force has been working to characterize in operational conditions since the jets entered service. The engagement doctrine developed over months of operational experience calls for a specific solution: acquire the target on the F-16's APG-66 radar in track-while scan mode, commit the AMRAAM from outside the missile's predicted maneuvering envelope, and clear the firing solution before the incoming weapon can execute an evasive vector. The KH-101 has no significant autonomous evasion capability, but its terrain-following profile during terminal approach makes it geometrically challenging. The intercept has to happen before that descent begins. In the corridor, in the window. At 11:52 p.m., Franco 1 called the first lock. The target was 68 kilometers out, tracking steady, altitude 380 meters, and descending slightly as it completed its navigational adjustment phase. Franco 2 had a parallel lock on the second contact, 71 kilometers, same profile. The lead element was in position. Then, the complication no one had planned for. The jamming started. Russian electronic warfare assets, likely operating from a naval platform in the Black Sea or from a ground-based system in occupied territory, activated a wideband suppression package precisely as Franco 1 committed to his first firing solution. The timing was not coincidental. Russian planners had apparently anticipated that Ukrainian radar systems might be positioned along the incoming corridor and pre-programmed the jamming activation to coincide with the estimated intercept window. The jamming degraded the APG-66's tracking resolution. Not completely, but enough that Franco 1's first AMRAAM failed to achieve active seeker lock after launch. The missile lost the target at 40 kilometers and went ballistic. 1 missile wasted, 10 inbound, 19 minutes to Odesa. The response was immediate and concrete. Franco 1 had trained for this. The degraded radar engagement protocol calls for a tighter firing solution. Closer range, higher certainty before commit. It costs time, It costs separation. It puts the interceptor aircraft closer to the incoming weapons detection envelope. But it works when jamming degrades the outer boundary solution. Franco 1 closed to 41 kilometers and re-engaged. This time, the AMRAAM acquired. The first KH-101 of the night died in a fireball over the northern Black Sea at 11:54 p.m. Real tactics, real consequences. War vector. The lead element worked through the first wave, 7 contacts over 11 minutes. Each engagement forced the pilots to account for the ongoing jamming, modifying their solutions, extending their closure ranges slightly, managing their missile loads with surgical precision. Franco 2 secured kills on contacts 2 and 4. Franco 1 took contacts 1, 3, and 5. Contact 6, the 7th missile in the forward group, came through a geographic gap where the intercept geometry had been compressed by the jamming's effect on search range. Franco 1 called the shot at 38 kilometers. The AMRAAM tracked clean. 6 missiles down. The lead element was Winchester, out of AMRAAM ordnance. They called the status and began a repositioning climb. The trail pair had been listening. Franco 3 and Franco 4 had the second wave on radar, 4 contacts, tracking the same corridor, 4 minutes behind the first group. The second wave was now 21 minutes from Odesa. The trail pair moved into intercept geometry. Here's the part that doesn't sit right, even when you look at the numbers on paper. The trail pair had exactly enough AMRAAM ordnance for 4 shots. 4 missiles, 4 incoming contacts, 0 margin. If any one of their solutions failed, if the jamming degraded another lock, if the geometry wasn't perfect, if a missile malfunctioned, something was going to reach the coast. How many missiles did Ukrainian F-16 pilots intercept that night before handing off to ground-based air defense? Was it A, 7, B, 9, or C, all 11? Hold that number in your head. We'll answer it at the end. Franco 3 engaged the first contact of the second wave at 12:03 a.m. The AIM-120 tracked clean despite the ongoing jamming. The trail pair had adjusted their radar settings based on what the lead element reported about the suppression package's characteristics. Franco 3's second AMRAAM took contact 2 at 12:05 a.m. Franco 4 was simultaneously working contacts 3 and 4. Contact 3 went down at 12:04 a.m. Contact 4, the last missile in the second wave, tracking lowest and fastest as it began its terminal descent profile, required Franco 4 to push inside 30 kilometers to secure the lock. The solution was tight. The AMRAAM launched at 12:06 a.m., tracking a missile already descending toward the coastal terrain following profile. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Contact 4 died at 12:07 a.m., 44 kilometers northwest of Mykolaiv. 10 missiles engaged, 9 destroyed. The math said the mission was complete, but there were 11 missiles in the original strike package. The 10th, a contact Ukrainian radar had tracked as part of the second wave but at a slightly different altitude than the others, had begun its descent before either element had a firing solution. It was running low, using the coastal terrain masking, and it was now inside the engagement envelope of the air intercept elements, but outside their available ordnance. The lead element was repositioning. The trail pair was Winchester, after the 4-contact engagement. The 10th missile was 17 minutes from Odesa. The 11th, assessed as part of the trailing 4, but apparently launched on a slightly different timer, materialized on radar at 12:08 a.m., tracking 6 degrees south of the primary corridor. Both remaining contacts were descending. Both were inside Ukrainian territorial airspace. Both were heading for Odesa. Franco 1 called the Iris-T battery at 12:08 a.m. and 14 seconds. The Iris-T SLM, the German-supplied surface-to-air missile system that has been a cornerstone of Odesa's air defense architecture since 2024, was already tracking both contacts. The battery commander had been monitoring the engagement from the moment Franco 1 called the first lock. The intercept handoff protocol had been rehearsed. The battery had firing solutions on both incoming missiles. What the protocol required was the formal release call, the order from the airborne intercept lead to transfer terminal engagement authority to the ground battery. What strikes me about this moment, looking back at it, is the weight of what was required. A pilot who had just spent 47 minutes in combat, who was Winchester on ordnance, who was exhausted and running on adrenaline, had to make a clear, precise, unambiguous release call in a degraded communications environment, with jamming still active, and 2 missiles descending toward a city of 1 million people. The call had to be right, and it had to happen immediately. It happened in 6 seconds. Franco 1, Raptor Franco. Release granted. 2 contacts. Your engagement. The Iris-T battery commander acknowledged. The system had firing solutions locked. 2 missiles launched within 90 seconds of the release call. The first Iris-T round intercepted contact 10 at 12:09 a.m. and 41 seconds. At an altitude of approximately 180 meters, approximately 28 kilometers northwest of Odesa's port district. The intercept generated a fragmentation pattern that Ukrainian damage assessment later confirmed as a complete kill. The warhead did not detonate, which is the optimal outcome, as it minimizes secondary damage. The second Iris-T round intercepted contact 11 at 12:10 a.m. and 7 seconds, at 210 meters altitude, approximately 31 kilometers from the port district. 9 kills confirmed. 2 impacts. The 2 missiles that reached Odesa came from contacts that had not been part of the primary intercept calculation. Post-engagement analysis suggests they were part of a secondary launch, a smaller supplementary group fired from a different 295 on a slightly modified corridor, designed as precisely the kind of gap exploiter that Russian planners hoped would survive any intercept attempt. In that narrow sense, Russian planning worked. 2 missiles struck Odesa. 1 impacted a warehouse district north of the port, causing structural damage and fire. 1 impacted a road junction approximately 400 meters from the grain terminal, damaging surface infrastructure but not penetrating to the terminal itself. If you believe tactics win wars, not technology, type war vector in the comments. Here's an unpopular opinion that might generate some pushback. The 2 missiles that reached Odesa were not primarily a failure of the pilots or the Iris-T battery. They were a failure of ISR, of the intelligence picture that classified the strike package as 11 missiles, when it was apparently 13. The 2 contacts that made it through were not in the original radar picture. They appeared late, at low altitude, on a modified approach. The 4 pilots who flew that night performed at the absolute ceiling of what their aircraft and training allowed. The gap that let 2 missiles through was upstream of them, in the targeting and launch characterization that should have identified every Tu-95 and every launch event. That's not a criticism of Ukrainian Air Force intelligence. It's an observation about the fundamental difficulty of tracking low observable launch events from Caspian basin distances. But it matters for the lessons, and we'll come back to it. What would you have done differently if you were the Iris-T battery commander with both contacts descending and the pilot's Winchester? The 6-second window for the release call was as tight as it gets. Tell us in the comments. We read every one. The 48 hours after the engagement tell a story that Russian information channels tried to obscure and Ukrainian authorities refused to narrate. Russian state media initially reported the strike as a success, claiming significant damage to Odesa's port infrastructure. Satellite imagery analysis published by multiple OSINT investigators in the days after showed a different picture. The grain terminal operational, primary port infrastructure intact, 2 secondary impact points with contained damage, and no disruption to ongoing export logistics. Russian post-strike reconnaissance, assessed from satellite imagery of subsequent Russian ISR activity over the area, showed the pattern of repeat observation passes that analysts associate with damage verification after a failed strike. They came back to look because what they found didn't match what they expected. Ukrainian authorities released nothing for 72 hours. No press conference, No social media post from official channels. No claim of a successful intercept. The first public information came not from Ukraine's military, but from the OSINT community. Analysts cross-referencing radar tracks, pilot communications archived in flight tracking data, and satellite imagery of the impact points. Even then, the official Ukrainian statement was minimal. Air Force Ukraine confirmed that a mass missile attack on Odesa had been substantially repelled, that air defense had functioned as designed, and that damage was limited. The pilots' names were not released. Their call signs did not appear in public records. As of the date of this analysis, they remain anonymous. One detail that stuck with me going through the post-engagement records: the radar track logs show Franco 1's aircraft making a single low pass over the Odesa coast at approximately 12:23 a.m. after the engagement was complete, after the Iris-T kills were confirmed, after the all-clear was called. One pass, no tactical purpose. Just a pilot, looking down at the city he'd spent 47 minutes protecting, at the port lights still on, at the grain terminal still standing. Then he turned northwest and flew home. There's a line in the after-action assessment that reads like the conclusion of something much larger than one night's engagement. Strike assessment complete. Primary objective neutralized. Force multiplier effect of pre-positioned intercept patrol confirmed operational. No friendly losses. 14 words at the end of a 47-minute engagement that prevented what would have been the most destructive single strike on Odesa's economic infrastructure since the war began. What was NATO's established doctrine for handling mass cruise missile saturation attacks before Ukraine operationalized this kind of pre-positioned airborne intercept in 2025 and 2026? Comment your analysis, because the answer reveals why what happened over Odesa that night is going to be in military aviation textbooks. The tactical lessons from May 14th are worth examining in detail because they extend well beyond the immediate context of the Ukraine-Russia war. The first lesson is about pre-positioning and pattern analysis. The KH-101's vulnerability window, that 90-second navigational adjustment phase before terminal descent, was not a secret. It was a known characteristic. What Ukraine did on April 23rd was build a systematic framework for predicting where that window would occur geographically, then positioning interceptors inside that framework before the strike happened. This is not reactive air defense. It's predictive air defense. The distinction matters. Reactive systems wait for incoming threats and respond as fast as possible. Predictive systems analyze launch patterns, establish pre-positioned intercept opportunities, and engage threats during their most vulnerable phase before they can execute terminal maneuvers. Ukraine developed this doctrine out of operational necessity, out of 4 years of mass strikes and the slow accumulation of data about Russian launch patterns. The result on May 14th was a 77% intercept rate at the airborne layer before ground-based systems were even engaged. The second lesson is about electronic warfare integration. The jamming that disrupted Franco 1's first firing solution was not improvised. It was timed and targeted. Russian planners understood that Ukrainian radar would likely be positioned along the corridor and pre-programmed a suppression event to coincide with the intercept window. What they did not account for was that Ukrainian pilots had trained for degraded radar engagements as a specific doctrine element. The protocol, tighter firing solutions, closer range, higher certainty before commit, cost Franco 1 AMRAAM and approximately 90 seconds. It did not cost him the engagement. Training for degradation rather than assuming nominal conditions is a lesson that air forces worldwide are absorbing from the Ukrainian experience. The third lesson is the ISR gap. 2 missiles reached Odesa because the intelligence picture was incomplete. The secondary launch group, assessed as 13 contacts rather than 11 in subsequent analysis, was either launched from a different 295 than the primary package or used a timing offset that masked the contacts in the initial radar picture. Closing that gap requires either closer surveillance of launch phase activity from Caspian basin distances or faster integration of multi-source track data. Ukraine is working on both. The point is not that the ISR failed catastrophically. It didn't. 77% airborne intercept rate against an incomplete picture is an extraordinary result. The point is that the gap will be closed, and the next engagement will be better. Will Russia be able to design a strike package sophisticated enough to saturate this kind of pre-positioned airborne intercept doctrine? Comment yes or no, because the answer is not obvious, and the reasoning matters as much as the conclusion. The fourth lesson is the most human one: 6 seconds. That is how long it took Franco 1 to make the release call that transferred terminal engagement authority to the IRIS-T battery. In 6 seconds, he assessed that his element was Winchester, that the trail pair was Winchester, that both contacts were inside terminal descent, and that the ground battery had valid solutions. He made the right call. In 6 seconds. After 47 minutes of combat, with jamming still active, with 2 missiles descending toward a city, the doctrine prepared him for that decision. The training gave him the tools to execute it, but the 6 seconds themselves were his. This is what modern air defense looks like at its operational frontier. Not just technology, not just doctrine. 4 people, in the dark, over the Black Sea, making the right calls under conditions designed to make that impossible. The answer to tonight's quiz: Ukrainian F-16 pilots intercepted 9 of 11 missiles at the airborne layer. 9 confirmed kills across 2 intercept elements, 6 by the lead pair, 3 by the trail pair. The final 2 contacts were engaged and destroyed by the IRIS-T SLM battery at Odesa. Of the 11 missiles in the original tracked strike package, 0 reached their primary target. 2 additional contacts, part of an untracked supplementary launch, impacted secondary areas with limited effect. The grain terminal survived. Port infrastructure continued operating within 24 hours of the strike. Russian post-strike reconnaissance confirmed the primary objective was not achieved. Answer B, 9, is correct. And the detail that makes it more significant than the raw number: 9 kills from 4 aircraft carrying finite ordnance, against a jamming environment, against a pre-planned suppression event, in 47 minutes of continuous combat. The AIM-120C performed at the boundary of its documented engagement envelope against a low observable target. The pilots performed beyond it. 3 questions this engagement leaves open, and that deserves serious analytical attention. Was the decision to establish the classified intercept corridor 3 weeks before the engagement the right tactical choice? On one level, the answer seems obvious. It worked. But pre-positioning a 4-ship patrol on a predictable schedule creates an ISR pattern that, if identified by Russian intelligence, could be used to design a strike that avoids the corridor entirely, or worse, to vector a counter-air intercept against the patrol itself. The Ukrainian Air Force accepted that risk deliberately. They judged that the intelligence value of catching a mass strike in the corridor outweighed the risk of the corridor being identified. May 14th validated that judgment. But the next strike will have different parameters, and Russian planners now know that corridor exists. Could Russian electronic warfare have been more effective? The jamming on May 14th disrupted 1 firing solution and cost 1 AMRAAM. A more sophisticated suppression package, or one activated earlier in the engagement sequence, might have compromised multiple solutions and changed the outcome. Ukrainian pilots adapted because their training included degraded radar protocols, but there is a jamming threshold above which adaptation becomes insufficient. Russia is investing in exactly that capability. The question is whether Ukrainian pilots will stay ahead of it. What would you have done differently if you were the Ukrainian Air Force commander planning the intercept doctrine on April 23rd, knowing you had 4 F-16s, finite AMRAAM ordnance, a classified corridor, and an enemy with significant electronic warfare capability? The doctrine that emerged from that planning session may be the most consequential piece of tactical thinking in the war's air domain. Comment your analysis. We want to know what you see. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades, because preparation defeats improvisation, Because 4 pilots over the Black Sea, anonymous and unnamed, held the line on a night that a city of 1 million people spent sleeping, and they want no recognition for it. The least we can do is understand exactly what they did and why it worked. The night sky over Odesa is quiet now. The port lights run their normal cycles. Grain ships move through the harbor toward the export corridors that keep Ukrainian agriculture connected to a world that depends on it. Northwest of the city, somewhere in the sea and the coastal terrain, the fragmentation patterns of 9 destroyed Kh-101 missiles are scattered across water and farmland, silent reminders that modern warfare punishes miscalculation without mercy, that saturation fails when the interceptor is already waiting, that 6 seconds can be the difference between a city that survives the night and one that doesn't. Real tactics, real consequences. War vector,